Book 7, The Soldier in the Middle of the World, Chapter 23. No, it wasn't a coincidence. It was very late by the time the lieutenant got back to the mansion and to bed. The fort had spent 2 hours searching by torchlight in the debris for wounded or any sign of the unknown officer. Surprisingly, no one was killed in the tree fall, as they were now calling it. There were only 5 soldiers trapped by the logs with broken legs, cracked ribs, and concussions. More injuries were caused by panicked soldiers running into each other in the dark. Despite the good news of few injuries, Major Twig was furious. The lieutenant was approaching the stairs to the command tower with the report that no more wounded could be seen when he heard Twig's shouts float down the stairs. "Don't you get it? He caused all of this. As a diversion, I'm sure of it." Twig, Sergeant Major Healy said soothingly as the lieutenant silently climbed the stairs. It was a remarkable coincidence, nothing else. Boulders have dislodged before. No, it wasn't a coincidence. As he left, he said, "Sorry about the mess in the forest." Healy, he's got to be an officer or a soldier or something. He was using Kay and Thorne's tactic of diversionary chaos, and tonight he was wearing a colonel's uniform. Who else besides someone who served in the army would know that tactic and have access to both a sergeant major's uniform and a colonel's uniform? The lieutenant stopped in the middle of the stairwell with his mouth agape. He knew the answer to that, but it was too remarkable to consider. And then he remembered. The uniform he saw had brass buttons. No officers wore brass buttons anymore. "Or Healy," the major's voice became so low the lieutenant strained to hear him. "What if the garters have returned?" Healy sighed. I suspected that a few weeks ago when we pulled that couple out of the forest, the ones wearing those unusual clothes, but now I really doubt it. Twig, you may not realize this," he answered quietly, "but I worked for the garters as a teen stealing goods. I knew a few of them, and they didn't live in the forests. They lived in Mount Seine and rivers. The garters took to the forests only to attack or frighten villages. I don't think there ever were any real garters. And once General Kay Thorne was dead, so were the garters." "But that's precisely it," Twig replied. "You're not the only one who knows the garters were frauds. What if someone else is trying to bring back the old secret ways? Did you ever take their oaths, Healy?" The lieutenant, still on the stairs, continued to hold his breath, trying to hear an answer. Healy must have just been moving his head. The major spoke again. "Well, maybe there were others in your generation who did, who've come back now to wage a secret war on the general." Twig, you're reading too much into this. I think it's more likely this was the work of some of Sargon's men. Thorne said there were a few officers unaccounted for. They would have access to the uniforms." "I know the ones missing, Healy. They're cowards. They're probably hiding between flaxen waves pretending to herd cattle. They'd never bother to come so far north, especially now that it's cold. Besides, why not torment the general in Idumea instead?" "I don't know, Twig. Maybe this was a statement of some kind, that they can make it all the way to Edge and attack the general's home fort." "So," Healy asked quietly, "was the man who attacked you the one you were looking for?" "Yes," Twig said, seething. "Not only did we not capture or identify him, he injured several in my fort and probably destroyed half the forest getting in." The lieutenant heard noises below him in the reception area and realized he would soon be seen. He faked a cough to announce someone was on the stairs and resumed climbing. Major Twig, huffing, came to the top of the stairs. "Lieutenant, what do you want?" "Sir," he said as he reached the office, "I'm here to report there are no more wounded and no fatalities." Twig glanced at Healy. "Well, I suppose that's good news." He turned back to the lieutenant, seemingly eager to get rid of him. "I heard you were trying to get the soldiers away from the tree fall. I'll be sure to mention that to your father in my next message. Good work." Twig waved at the lieutenant to dismiss him. Along the walk home, he couldn't get the words out of his mind. Who else would have access to both a master sergeant uniform and a colonel's uniform? It must have been Colonel Shin's jacket, the only one with brass buttons, but who had they allowed to take it? His grandmother treasured the jacket too much to let just anyone wear it. The lieutenant entered the quiet mansion, passed Slither's room where he was already snoring, and went up to his bedroom. He undressed, still lost in thought, and lay down on his bed to stare up at the ceiling. The unknown man must have been the officer who ran past him at the forest. The lieutenant shut his eyes to concentrate on the voice. The noise of the forest was loud, but the officer shouting next to him, then in front of him, was even louder. It was his father. His real father. To his surprise, tears streamed out of his eyes and slid into his ears. Peto Shin was the only man who'd be trusted to wear both Zenus's and Shin's old uniforms. He was the correct height and weight, and that voice. Again his eyes welled with tears. Why was he here? Looking for his son? Heard about the guide? Or maybe they knew they were exposed. His chin trembled as he realized he wouldn't know, maybe for years, why his father was there. It hadn't occurred to him before how long all of this could take. And he hadn't realized until then just how much he missed his father, his real father. He was still alive and certainly well, running fast and naturally in the forest. No one else would have thought of creating a tree fall as a diversion triggered by a boulder. The lieutenant smiled with pride. What had his father, his real father, done so as to fluster the commander and terrify the soldiers? It was obviously in the Shin's blood to cause chaos. The lieutenant grinned in the dark. My papa, he thought, the garter. Peto laid on his bedroll and stared up at the stars. The sideways swordsman was pointing to Salem. The scouting party was above the boulder line, safely sleeping in the narrow trail normally used by horses. Around him, Peto heard the breathing and soft snores of the other men. Newt and the two other scouts had finally returned from inspecting the position of the boulder, having had to wait until the last of the soldiers had gone back into the fort. That Newt had fallen asleep after his fit of, "It worked, it really worked," Peto found remarkable. He thought the physics professor would be bouncing all night long. Ralph lay next to Peto, having finally drifted off to sleep. But before he couldn't stop talking about young Pear. I saw him. I should have recognized his size. I wasn't even looking for him. I was too worried about the trees. I should have run down there and grabbed him. There was no time, Ralph, Peto consoled him. You would have been caught by the logs. Young Pear might have been hit too. I don't know. I didn't see him again. You were right to stay in the forest, and I was right to continue with the plan. The Creator gave us a gift to see him. There was nothing more we were to do tonight. So stop tormenting yourself and be grateful for the gift. Ralph finally believed it, but Peto still struggled. He knew it was young Pear as soon as he ran past the tall young man, recognizing his voice as he was shouting at the soldiers to run. The urge to grab his son had been overwhelming when he caught sight of him, and he briefly saw his son's surprised expression. Maybe he recognized him, but Peto doubted it. Maybe if he spotted the jacket in that short moment, he would have thought of his grandfather instead. At least young Pear was trying to do something good by shouting at the soldiers to run away. He may have even been wearing a lieutenant's braid on his shoulder. Peto wasn't sure. How his son could have been promoted to lieutenant would be an interesting story to hear someday when he returned. The whole night would be intriguing to hear from his perspective. Someday. Peto's eyes filled with tears, and he let them spill out unheeded, just as he had earlier that night. It was the greatest hope he'd felt since young Pear ran away. It may take years to bring him home, but if that's what it took, well, then that's what it took. Peto could still run through the fort every now and then at twilight, just to catch sight of his son. After all, he was, Peto thought as he grinned into the dark, a garter. He closed his eyes and soon was dreaming, but it felt far more real than a mere dream. He had on the jacket again, and his father was standing in front of him, wearing all white, with his hands on his waist and grinning from ear to ear. "I always knew someday you'd be in uniform, son," Perrin chuckled. "What a great birthday present for my 74th. Watching you in action as Colonel Shin. Excellent work. Messages communicated with no loss of life? Better than I could do. We knew Thorn wasn't about to bite, but it was the Creator's will that he be given an opportunity. I'm proud of you, Peto. Tell your mother I miss her. Wear the jacket home for her, all right, as a gift. She knows what day today was, too." Before Peto could respond, Perrin was gone. As the lieutenant drifted off to sleep, he heard, "Your father looked great as a garter colonel, didn't he? I don't know when I've ever had so much fun on my birthday." The scouting party was still half a mile away from the canyon entrance, but Peto chuckled when he heard the distinctive squeal of joy echoing up the canyon that could only have come from his wife. They'd been sighted. The dark blue jacket must have stood out in the great canyon. Ralph chortled. "Mama was waiting at the entrance 2 days ago. When you weren't with me, I thought for sure she'd ride up and go to Edge to find you herself. Good thing Uncle Shem and Aunt Calla were there to hold her horse." Peto looked back to Woodson. "I think I better ride ahead." Woodson grinned. "I think you better too." Peto prodded Clark 14 into a gallop down the narrow trail. As he neared the entrance, he spied the dozen or so horses, but also a wagon waiting. There'd be only one person who'd insist on a wagon. He quickly checked the jacket to see if all the brass buttons were still fastened, because Mari Shin would lecture him on the proper wearing of a uniform if they weren't. "Peto!" Lilla yelled as he rode up to them. "You're all right! I was so worried!" She slid off her horse and rushed to her husband. Peto dismounted and caught her in a hug. "I'm fine, Lilla," he said and kissed her. "Always was." She kissed him again, and he stepped back for inspection. Lilla held his hands as she looked him up and down. "Colonel Perrin Shin rides again," she whispered with a shudder. "Indeed he does." Peto looked behind Lilla to see Shem helping his mother get down from the wagon. Mari burst into a grin and strode over to him for a hug. "Look at you," she said as she pulled away. "So much like your father. Oh, I wish Perrin could have seen you." Peto was already choking up. "Mother, he did." Shem, now standing next to them, regarded Peto with surprise. Peto smiled. "I saw him last night in a dream, Mother. He said he always expected to see me someday in the uniform. He told me to wear it home for you. I guess for his birthday present." Mari was already crying, making the next thing Peto needed to say even more difficult. "He said to tell you he misses you," he choked out. Mari nodded vigorously and hugged him back. "Thank you. Now why can't I have a dream of him?" She stomped her foot. Peto, Lilla, and Shem chuckled. "Just not the right time, Mari," Shem explained. "But Peto, what news?" Peto turned to Shem, remembering there was business to take care of. "Thorn received the message, and he sent one back. He wanted my identity, the location of the food, and my surrender. His terms, not ours. I don't think anybody believed we really had anything to offer." Shem closed his eyes and shook his head. 3 of his assistants, sitting on the horses behind him, sighed in disappointment. "Guide," Peto said softly, "General Shin also told me they didn't expect Thorn to accept the offer, but it was the Creator's will that he be given the opportunity." Shem opened his eyes, red and damp, and cleared his throat. "Excellent work, Rector Shin." He leaned closer to his brother-in-law. But Peyto, I'm dying to hear how you made it into the fort and back out again with everyone waiting for you. Peyto grinned. It was great, Shem. I'll tell it to everyone back at the estates. I'm a regular garter. Lilla put her hands on her hips. A garter? You are never leaving me again, Peyto Shin. Don't you dare think about going back down. Peyto grabbed her and kissed her again. Don't worry, it's not my calling. And I did a few things with my knife that only Colonel Shin would do. I think it's best I take this jacket off before it feels comfortable. But Lilla, he took her face in his hands. His eyes were sparkling as he said, It's a good thing I went. I saw him and heard him. It was only for a moment, but now we know for certain that young pair's still alive and serving at the fort in... Peyto should have been ready, but he wasn't. He flinched as his wife squealed again. Her loud and happy sobs echoed up the canyon and reached the approaching scouting party. Ralph smiled in embarrassment to Woodson, Newt, and the others. He told her. The next morning, the lieutenant woke up with a smile on his face, filled with defiant energy from Garter Peyto Shin. But there was still too much he needed from General Thorne before he could overthrow him, take over the army, and peacefully unite the world with Salem. He knew he was on the right road, though. Peyto Shin, who had never completed a day of command school, had soldiers obeying and following him because he was in the right uniform, shouting the right things. The soldiers would follow anyone who would save them. The lieutenant studied diligently that morning, then after midday meal headed over to the fort for the afternoon. Instead of walking to the command tower, he first went to survey the damage from the night before. The number of felled trees was impressive. Dozens of citizens stood on the edges of the devastation, watching as many more soldiers pulled out timbers, chopped off the remaining limbs, and stacked them neatly on top of each other. The lieutenant meandered behind the villagers, where several were crouching, inspecting the logs. The work of garters, it must be. No, they were wiped out. Where would they live now anyway? Deceit's gone. I think it was natural. All of these trees are dead. My son pushed one over just to see if he could, and it came down easily once the dead roots were dislodged. Start one going, it'll take down everything else. I don't think so. Only a few would fall before they became entangled. But look how high that cleared section is. A few hundred paces up the hillside. I never realized it actually was a hillside. I never realized how deep the forest is. Is that section still considered a forest now? One could just walk right up into it. But look at the bottom of this tree. A breaking tree would splinter, but this root is clearly chopped through. It's a clean cut, like from a saw or a hatchet. This was deliberate, I'm telling you. Garters. But why? We have nothing for them to steal. Maybe they're worse off than we are. The lieutenant hid his smirk about garters as he strolled over to the soldiers. A few were analyzing the boulder that stood taller than any of them, as if they'd never seen a rock before. They touched it gingerly in case it might explode. He continued along the missing tree line until he came to the middle of it and looked up the hillside. Hundreds of trees were felled in an enormous triangle. At the top must have been the boulder beginning the cascade. He had to investigate it. He'd know the cuts his father's jagged blade would make, but he didn't feel comfortable inspecting the trees among the soldiers and villagers. Without another thought, he headed up the hillside, picking his way through the litter of timbers and branches into that which was no longer a forest. "Lieutenant!" came a shout from below. "And just where do you think you're going?" He turned around to see an angry captain standing several dozen paces away, his hands on his waist. "Just to inspect the damage, sir," he said with an easy smile. "No soldiers are to go into the forest, Lieutenant, except to save a life. The general has yet to lift that rule, and until he does, you and everyone else is to stay out of the forest." But it's not a forest anymore, the lieutenant pointed out. No more trees, so now it's a meadow. The captain gave him a quizzical look. What's a meadow? The lieutenant was startled. It never occurred to him that no one here knew what a meadow was. Then again, no one in the world ventured into the mountains, never knew more than what they could see from the villages. All work had ceased, and every soldier and villager was staring at him, waiting for an explanation. He kept the smile on his face as he tried to fix his mistake. Why, sir, a meadow is what we can call this now. An empty space in the trees. You can change the name if you wish, but it certainly doesn't seem to qualify as a forest anymore. I promise I won't leave this meadow. I just wanted to see if I can discern what caused this. Without waiting for a response, he continued to pick his way through the timbers. The captain grumbled and looked around. Back to work, he shouted. Finish clearing this treeless place. The lieutenant grinned at the mess before him. It took him longer to reach the top than he thought it would, climbing through a maze of logs and branches and often catching his bootlaces. When he finally got to the top, he felt the urge to continue on into the forest, climbing into the shelter of the trees. But he also knew there was at least one set of eyes watching him closely. He looked down at the expanse he'd climbed. The height surprised him, almost as much as noticing he had an audience of about 100 people watching, along with the captain. He waved awkwardly to the crowd, and the captain, unamused, folded his arms. The lieutenant crouched to inspect the ground at the pinnacle of the triangle. He grinned to realize the ground had been deliberately disturbed, as if the soil had been shoveled away to undercut a now missing boulder. Inspecting the remaining tree roots revealed the same thing. They were severed, most likely with a jagged knife that also doubled as a saw. He fingered the wood, knowing exactly who did the precise damage to the trees he'd devoted his adult life to studying. Rector Shin, how look the trees? You can return now, Lieutenant. The words drifted up to him. Down below, the captain was tapping his foot impatiently. The lieutenant smiled to the forest. Some other time, Pugga, he whispered, but they look fantastic. He made his way back down to the flat ground again. The captain was waiting, not knowing what else to say, especially since they'd eventually come to the same conclusion. The lieutenant tried something different. The truth. Sir, it appears that the roots were cut, probably by a saw or a hatchet of some sort. The captain was dubious. We would have heard the noise. Not necessarily. If a sharp knife were used, it would be very quiet, and hatchet sounds can be muffled by the ash in the forest. Besides, I don't think too much effort was needed to weaken the trees. Shall I report my suspicions to Major Twig? I'm due in the command tower now anyway. Go ahead. Tell him the cleanup efforts here are going as expected. The lieutenant ignored the stares from the villagers and soldiers as he made his way to the northeast gates. But one citizen murmured, They did become garters in the forest, and now the Shins are coming back. The lieutenant nearly laughed. At the command tower, Sergeant Major Healy nodded a greeting. You're almost late, Lieutenant. Yes, sir, but I'm not, he pointed out. I wanted to see the damage to the forest. And? Healy asked, not looking up from a document he was reviewing. I think it was caused by men, the lieutenant said. I checked the top of the tree fall, and the remaining roots show signs of cutting. The ground where the boulder likely rested also shows signs of being compromised. Healy's head shot up when the lieutenant mentioned having gone to the top of the clearing. Major Twig now stood at the door of the command office. You went to the top, Lieutenant? The major bristled. Into the forest? The lieutenant shook his head. No, sir, I did not go into the forest. Really, with no trees, it's not a forest anymore, is it, sir? The captain says cleanup is going according to schedule, sir. Major Twig stared at him. It's still the forest, Thorn, and you shouldn't have done it. I didn't do anything dangerous, sir. Last night I heard you suggesting that it was caused by the man we failed to apprehend. From what I saw, I think you're correct." Twig twitched. "I thank you for your efforts, but I don't need you violating the rules of the army to verify my suspicions. What would your father say?" The lieutenant smiled. "I think my father would be very proud of my decision, sir." It was getting easier to tell the truth all the time. And that's the end of that kind of short chapter. Thank you.